Army of Dogmen. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I'd like to tell you my family legend. When I was a kid through my 30s, I used to laugh about this story, as I felt I was more sophisticated than my ancestors. I grew up in Nashville, Tennessee, and I went to college, and I barely have any accent at all. So I looked down upon my predecessors who I felt were primitive people. Then, one day, I had my own sighting of a creature that looked like a dog-headed man, and that situation humbled me. I'll tell you about that sighting too, okay? I've gone from being embarrassed of this story to feeling quite proud to be added to it, at least as a footnote at the end. My wife? She's not so proud to be associated with monsters as I am, so she's not allowing me to give out our names when I tell you this tale. We're both retired, and in my opinion, we have nothing to lose. But she says she doesn't want to be known as that batty old couple that think they're seeing werewolves. Be that as it may, I'm sure of what I saw, and I'm also sure by now that my family legend is in fact true. I heard different versions of it from my grandfather, my grandmother, my dad, and my aunt, and I'll try to piece them all together here in one place to make it one big saga for you. I guess you can call it the Army of Dogmen and the Family of Goblins, or something like that if you want. This story happened back during the Depression, which, in spite of its name, was still far less depressing than most of the days I'm enduring now. You were allowed to go where you wanted during the Depression, and we had FDR as president finding jobs for men to do to support their families. This isn't a story about that, though. This is a story about two different kinds of monsters, or cryptids, or whatever you want to call them. These were not just animals. These were intelligent creatures, as intelligent as humans. They were some other kind of person very alien to us, but they were and are people of a kind. That's why I call them monsters. I don't mean it as an insult, but rather as a sign of respect. I'm very afraid of these things, and unless you're Morton Downey Jr. as Iron Man flying around in the sky in a metal suit, you'd be wise to fear these intelligent kinds of cryptids too. I was born September 9th, 1950 in Nashville, where both my parents worked around the music industry there. They would sometimes perform at local clubs, but mainly they did secretarial and grunt work, as they never really caught on as musicians. Still, they earned enough to send both me and my sister to college, where we were both taught to look down on our hard-working parents. In the same way, I sent my own son to college so that he could protest me, and he sent his kids to college so they could tell him he should apologize for things that happened 150 years before he was born. The older I get, the less I understand why we send our kids to college at all. It takes them 20, 30, 40 years to unlearn all the brainwashing that the rich people put into them. The only people I want to apologize to are my parents and my grandparents, who I disrespected when they first told me this combination of stories that I'm about to tell to you. The family house in those days was a solitary one, situated in the woods near good hunting and good fishing. I never got to see the place. I have no memories of it myself. The house used to be located right near what is now the White Oak Campground, with a bend of the Green River surrounding it in every direction except the north. I went camping there after my own Dogman sighting years later, and I searched around for any sign of where the house used to be. I found nothing. No foundation, no anything. Of course, I didn't even bring a metal detector with me, so it's not like I went there like an archaeologist or anything. My point is, I'm not 100% sure where the house was exactly, but it must have been somewhere in there, since I've been told that by 4 different relatives over the course of my lifetime. Since I guess around the early 1970s, that area is part of the Mammoth Cave National Park, and in fact there are caverns underground all through the area that spelunkers have been investigating for 100 years or probably more. It's those caves underground and the possibility of more entrances and exits to the tunnel system than we may have yet discovered that is or are the crux of my story. I feel strongly that Dogman and at least some other cryptids use these caves both as shelters and as underground superhighways to get from one area to another without being seen by people. My grandmother told me that we have goblins in Kentucky, and I laughed at her. Since then, I've heard a number of other stories of people seeing small, big-eyed men in various places around the state, and each time, I get chills up my spine. Sometimes people say they saw aliens, because they apparently look a lot like the small gray men that people associate with the UFOs, like in the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind and so forth. They are not usually associated with flying vehicles or lights in the sky, however. They are more associated with cave entrances and abandoned mine shafts. They don't communicate telepathically like the gray. Instead, they chitter-chatter at you, like rodents almost. At any rate, when Grandma complained that she had goblins coming up and staring at her through the kitchen window when she was trying to wash dishes at night, Grandpa would go outside with his shotgun and search around. They would scatter when they saw him coming, but then they would just come back the next night. Grandpa said he got fed up with his wife's complaining, and he set about to do something about the harassment they were receiving. He never once doubted his wife that there were small, pale, big-eyed little men coming around in the night, and so he put together a plan. If he had known it would lead to him coming face to face with an actual, real-life, upright walking canid, he might have reconsidered what he was doing. Instead of sitting and reading by the fire that night as Grandma cleaned up, Grandpa put on his darkest clothes, found a hiding spot in the back, and waited. When the little goblin men came by to bother his wife that night, Grandpa stood up and fired a warning shot into the air. The little men ran away. They did not float away as the famous Kelly Hopkinsville goblins are said to have done 20 or so years later, but they ran bipedally. Grandma and Grandpa both said they were thin little critters with big clawed hands and oversized heads, standing maybe 2.5 to 3 feet tall. Unlike the Kelly Hopkinsville creatures, which had large pointed ears, these had no ears visible at all. Grandpa said that when they walked, it was upright, but when they were scared and fleeing, they ran a sort of 3 or 4-legged run, much like how chimpanzees will occasionally use one or both front arms to propel themselves more quickly. They also would grab trees and poles and rocks at points with one large hand or the other, and swing themselves forward. So when it was every goblin for himself, they would use any means necessary to get themselves away from danger. By the way, the location of that famous 1955 goblin attack is about 100 miles as the crow flies to the southwest. It raises the question, are there goblins living in the cave systems of Kentucky? And if so, could there be multiple species of them? The big-eared goblins down in Hopkinsville and the more alien-looking ones with no visible ears in the Mammoth Cave area? I doubt they could have evolved ears in the 20 years between the sightings, so these must have been two separate kinds of goblins. We ask, do goblins exist? When perhaps the more correct question to ask might be, how many kinds of goblins exist? So Grandpa followed the little goblin men to see where they ran to. He claimed that he briefly had one by its thin arm, but he said the creature snapped at his arm with a bite as hard as any predator, and that he was forced to let him or her or it go. The small creatures dove into a hole under a rock that had long grass growing off of it that entirely hid the entrance of the cave. He would never have known that was there if he hadn't seen them dive and roll into it. Getting down on his hands and knees to look inside, Grandpa had to lay his head down on the ground just to get low enough to see anything, but it was too dark to see very much. The goblins themselves were barely able to claw their way inside, and there was no way he could follow them. Resolving that it might be possible to block up the entrance, Grandpa began collecting various sized stones and piling them up to do the job with. While he was preoccupied, Grandpa began to hear a sound that sent shivers through him. He was hearing some larger beast growling at him. Turning around, he saw what we would now call a dogman. When the two locked in eye contact, the creature began making this angry sound, somewhat like a barking noise, but longer and more stretched out. It was similar to the sounds that wolves make, but this creature was as different from a normal wolf as the goblins he had seen were different to the Kelly Hopkinsville one some 20 years later. This dog seemed much larger than a normal wolf, and it crouched in a different way too. Its front seemed more lifted off the ground than it should have been. Its front arms were far longer than its back ones. As the creature's agitation grew, it reared up on its hind legs, and Grandpa said he had to look up at that point to see its head. Gramps was, I think, around 5'10" or something like that. This means that the dogman must have been well over 6 feet tall when it reared back on its hind legs. I remember even in my cynical youth asking what the face or head of the thing looked like, and Grandpa said it looked both intelligent and primitive at the same moment. When I asked him to elaborate since I didn't understand, he told me it looked like a primitive carnivorous mammal with oversized teeth, binocular vision, terrifying-looking Ginsu knife claws, and a decent amount of speed, too. But at the same time, it had intelligence in its eyes. You looked in them, and you saw a thinking mind behind those eyes looking right back at you. It seemed as though it could beat you with its strength, agility, claws, and teeth, but it could probably outthink you as well if it needed to. I asked Grandpa what he did in that situation, expecting him to tell me a tall tale of defeating the dogman in battle. He surprised me by saying he ran for his life, squealing like a stuck pig, all the way home. He thought he had lost the creature about halfway back, as he didn't see him or hear him anymore at around the midway point of his run home. Once Grandpa got back inside, both my grandparents fell to their knees in prayers of thanks. They were very spiritual folks, even years later when I knew them. The next morning, Grandpa went back to the tiny cave entrance armed with dynamite, blowing it up to try to get himself inside. He caused a partial cave-in instead, and decided to pour cement in to seal it up. Then, he got help and positioned large, heavy stones and boulders on top of the former cave entrance, hoping that this would be the last his wife would see of the goblins, and the last that he would see of dog-headed cave monsters. Even as a kid, I saw a flaw in this logic. That cave entrance was too small for the dogman to have gone in or out of. If he was associated with the goblins, and to me that seemed almost certain due to the timing of his arrival, then there had to be at least one other and larger entrance to the cavern system located somewhere else nearby. Grandpa agreed with me, but said that at the time he hadn't really thought that part through. He was initially confused about the dogman's appearance, and he was not certain it was there to protect the goblins. He hadn't put two and two together yet, possibly due to his shock over what had just happened. And it was that lapse in critical thinking that almost led to his downfall when the family home came under attack that night from the army of dogmen. When Grandma was doing dishes after dinner, Grandpa was in the back of the house taking a nap after a stressful couple of days. Grandma screamed in the kitchen and dropped a dish, which crashed loudly to the hard kitchen floor. Grandpa said he was out of bed clutching his rifle before he even had his eyes back open, and he ran to the kitchen. He didn't need to run that far to see what the problem was, as the entire house was surrounded by a number of creatures which all closely resembled the dog-headed hairy caveman he had been chased home by the night prior. I don't remember if they had a telephone in those days in that house, but I know Grandpa didn't call on anyone else for help. He and Grandma closed the wooden inner shutters to the windows that they had, and they double-bolted the doors. There was a hidden basement under the floor that Grandpa helped Grandma and the kids get into. Then he piled up his ammunition and prepared to try to hold off the large, fierce, and angry dogmen, all seemingly out for revenge. My father and my aunt both corroborated this part of the story, although neither of them seemed to have clear memories of what the dogman actually looked like. Dad said he saw one of the goblins once, and he thought it was a bald monkey of some sort, but he had no memory of seeing upright canines. As a side note, it was really that hidden basement that I was looking for when I camped out at the campground that's now located where this alleged event supposedly took place. I never found any sign of it, though, although I suppose it might have been filled in a long time before I even got there. So, my grandpa told me he was firing out the windows at the dogmen, right through the glass windows as need be. He would open the shutters on a window, get a few shots in, and then the dogmen would rush that window, making a huge racket of a noise in the process. Grandpa would then close and lock that shutter, then move to another window and fire out those windows. The dogmen seemed to notice the sound when he'd fire, but they never reacted as though they were being hit. A few times, he was certain he couldn't possibly miss, and yet, the dogman he was aiming at wouldn't even act as though he had gotten a mosquito bite. It was almost as if they had an invisible force field around them or something, unless they were just so powerful that what would take down a bear didn't even bother them in the least. Grandma suggested that he should have used silver bullets, and as silly as that sounds, I don't know that she was wrong. The creatures fought till almost dawn, when Grandma and the kids finally came back upstairs in the morning. Grandpa was lying passed out on the floor, and Grandma said at first she thought she had lost him. It turned out he was just physically exhausted and had fallen unconscious. The wolves had not succeeded in getting inside, and for a moment, Grandma thought everything was going to be all right. When she walked outside, though, she could see that things were far from okay. The exterior of the house had been torn and shred by this pack of insane, ravaging beastmen. There were parts of the roof that were torn so thin that one more night like the previous one, and those creatures would be inside their attic. She and the kids immediately went to work packing family heirlooms into crates and then driving them to relatives to store in their attics and basements. They just cleared that house out, completing half of it before Grandpa had even woken up from the night before. That began a long period where my father stayed with his uncle and my aunt stayed with her friends, and Grandma and Grandpa moved around for a while until they could afford to build a new family home. It was cheaper to build than to buy back then. It was a very different time, and that generation was not as afraid of hard work as my generation and all of you who have come after us. When I think of how strong and hard my grandparents were, I wonder if I would have even survived the things that they took in stride. So, I don't recall hearing any other goblin or dogman stories, and I think that's where it ended, essentially. They didn't move that far away, to be honest, and their next house was less than 40 miles from the first one, but I guess they got lucky, and they weren't bothered again by anything like this. Now jump with me to a year in the early 2000s. I'm thinking it was probably 2003, but I might be slightly off. My father left us in 2001, and my mom 2 or 3 years later, so this was 2003 or 2004. I had attended a service for my mother that day. It was not the funeral, but some sort of viewing of the body, I think. Terribly gruesome seeing her lying there. I was against the idea of doing it that way, but my sister overruled me. I went for a drive just to clear my head and try to feel less depressed and less creepy. I mean, I felt pretty down that day and very tense too. My intention was just to drive through nature in order to feel normal again. Open the windows, breathe real air, feel like a human being. I didn't even realize consciously what I was doing, but all of a sudden I found myself driving down old Route 70, which passes through the Mammoth Cave Park over there. Man, I wasn't more than a stone's throw from that loop in the river where the old family home was supposed to have been. So I was driving down the road past that little staircase off the road that leads up to a trail through the woods, right? And right next to that little staircase, this big, hairy, muscular, man-like dog-headed monster comes walking on out right into the road. It had to have been 8 feet tall if it was an inch. It just casually walked right out into the road from my right, crossed that road in a couple or 3 steps, and then was gone from my sight. It was so fast that I didn't even have time to slam on the brakes before it was gone. Yet, it didn't seem to be in the slightest bit of a hurry. He didn't look in my direction. He didn't care that I was there. He didn't mind who or what saw him. This was the true king of the woods, a large, upright walking bipedal canine, covered in thick, dark, gray fur. It was in the middle of the day, not at night at all. The Dogman didn't seem to have any desire to hide himself in the slightest. I've recently seen a video of one of these things digging up a graveyard during the day. This was sort of like that, but the one I saw was not so thin as the one in that video. This was like the professional wrestler version of Dogman. The one in that video looked like a skinny young Jerry Lewis compared to the one I saw trot across Route 70 right in front of me. It had pointed ears like that one, though. I think this one could have been the daddy or granddaddy of that one, as this was one immense fellow. That sighting is why I camped out alone in that campground. These steps, I think, lead to the Turnhole Bend Nature Trail, and that Dogman seemed to be coming from the exact place where Grandma saw the goblins and Grandpa accidentally started that major conflict with the army of Dogmen. Some people have told me that I imagined what I saw, and others have told me that it was a tulpa that I created myself by thinking about my family's old stories. If either of those guesses are true, then my imagination should be hired out by some Hollywood studio, because those special effects sure looked real and not imaginary. To me, using Occam's razor, I think my sighting adds a lot of credence to my family's legend. At least, it does for me. I now feel certain that not only do goblins exist in Kentucky, not only do dogmen exist there too, but both species somehow in some way have an alliance of some sort. I don't know if it's like two tribes who look out for each other, or if one is like the pet of the other, but the two are strongly aligned to each other. If that were not true, then my grandfather would never have had to face the army of Dogmen. If you ask me, Friday, that is my day, either Calendar Friday or Adam Friday. Please join me in thanking today's executive producer, Adam Friday, for making this episode possible. Adam joined our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com, where you can choose your own level and get different perks, such as our secret uncensored Dogman stories, or our over 15 hours of archived secret stories as well. Another way you can join is by clicking the join link under this video to become a channel member. $10 channel members get all our perks, including being able to see our shows in advance of the general public whenever possible. Don't go anywhere, because we've got over 90 minutes more of Dogman stories for you in this episode. Sit back, get comfortable, and check out the story that we call Dogman at the Montana Vortex. Dear Scary Stories NYC. I went to the Montana Vortex to see if it was real, and I had a very strange combination of experiences that involved something that looked like a werewolf or an upright walking canine. I wouldn't blame anyone who didn't believe this story, because it starts weird and then it gets weirder. Also, I expect some of you to accept that I'm telling the truth, but to think that I must be crazy, or maybe I was lightheaded when these things happened. I won't say that you're wrong, as that's something that has occurred to me as well. Sometimes we live through experiences that are so strange, it's probably wise not to assume that it all happened in a literal, everyday manner. Maybe this happened in another form of reality or a nearby dimension. I'm not equipped to understand things on that level, but I do know that both alternate worlds and alternate states of consciousness are real. If I had a running movie camera recording all of this, would it have seen what I saw? And if it didn't, would that necessarily mean that it was only happening in my mind? Or could my mind just have been in tune with a different frequency of information and reality? Now I'm not even sure what I'm saying anymore, so let me just tell the story, starting from the beginning. I had not traveled to Montana to visit the Vortex. In fact, I don't think I'd even heard of it before I got to Montana and saw a tourist pamphlet about it. How I got to Montana is another story. I had decided to get away from my life after my girlfriend dumped me, and I got fired from my job over the same 2-week period. I had been given 6 weeks severance pay, and I was subletting a room bi-weekly from an old friend, so I was able to just cut and run. The first thing I did was get on a bus to Sioux City, Iowa to visit another old friend that I had looked up to in high school. I really wanted him to give me sage advice like he used to back when we were in school together. Well, I had forgotten that he was married to a woman I briefly dated, but apparently my old buddy had not forgotten that I used to be with his wife. He acted suspicious of me, coming out all the way to Sioux City the way I did. Then, when I told him about my girlfriend dumping me, he got even more suspicious about my sudden presence. He thought I had come out there to try and steal his wife away, and it became clear the only advice he was going to give me was to go away. That's what I wanted to do, but I had nowhere to go. My ex-friend suggested I head to the Pacific Northwest. He told me that's where I belonged. This was some years back, and I didn't at the time realize he meant that as an insult. I started to look into transportation to Washington State, but my heart wasn't into it. I still felt defeated and lost. I needed more time off before plunging back into life. While watching something on their TV, I saw a commercial that showed a guy camping. That looked so peaceful to me that I decided I would go camping in the wilderness and hike my way over to Washington State instead of going there by bus or train. And this is how I ended up in Montana, by hiking up diagonally northwest through South Dakota. The Montana Vortex is located up on the northwest side of Montana, not far from Canada. So I took the tour they give, and it was a lot of fun, but I don't know if I was believing in the place as being some genuine kind of mystery vortex to space or anything. The house they have is built on an angle, so it feels like the world has gone crazy. It's just a trick of perspective, but you can twist your ankle in there if you aren't careful. It's that strange a place. I think there are a number of other mystery houses, all functioning on the same trick of the eye as this one. That's not their only attraction, though. There's also a place where you're supposed to become 4 to 6 inches taller or shorter, depending on where you stand. Again, to me, that was a trick of the eye because it's located right in front of the tilted mystery house. I even stood there myself trading places with another person, and it did seem to be real, but I wasn't believing my own eyes. I had no complaints though because it sure felt real, and I couldn't prove for a fact that it wasn't happening. After the tour, I wandered the grounds alone and came across a smaller so-called vortex that had a spiral circle on top of it, made from dark and light stones. You're supposed to follow the path on the ground around and around until you eventually make it to the center, where a big crystal sits. During this, I began to feel strange, and there was an odd sort of almost buzzing in my head. Still, I felt like this was a psychosomatic kind of thing, that it was happening because I expected something weird to happen. I almost felt dizzy as I was following the path in the beginning, but as I relaxed into it, it almost became pleasurable. At least, it felt relaxing if not entirely enjoyable. At points I felt the urge to jump out of that circle. That's how much I was starting to semi-believe in the vortex energy at that point. Just then, I heard a voice in my head saying, "Daniel, you're back," and I flipped out. It sounded like a man standing behind me, like directly behind me. I turned around in total shock, amazed that nobody was there. I looked around in the trees surrounding the vortex to see if there might be some sound equipment or speakers up there, something that could have projected that sound behind me, but I didn't see anything. Now, the name that the voice said was not actually Daniel, but the name he did say was my father's name. I had not seen my father for years, but when I was growing up, people always used to say we looked like twins. I actually at that point was dyeing my hair in order to look less like my father. I also have tattoos and I used to have piercings just to look different than he looks. Apparently, I still looked like him though, to whoever the intelligence was behind that creepy voice out of nowhere. After that very strange experience, I left the park and returned to where I was camping on foot. Along the way, I remembered another thing that makes the story weirder. My father was not from Montana, and as far as I know, he had never been to Montana in his life. Dad came from New York City, but took a job outside of Chicago where he met my mom. That's where I grew up and had lived my entire life until this adventure started. So what did that voice mean? Welcoming my father back to Montana? Unless it was welcoming him back to some other state of reality or awareness? Or what if the voice was an inner one? What if it was my subconscious welcoming my father back in some metaphorical or spiritual sense? Was I telling myself I had achieved maturity through calling me by my father's name? That doesn't ring true to me because my dad was never really a symbol of maturity in my mind. And I wasn't drunk when it happened, so I don't think my subconscious would have meant it in an insulting way either. I couldn't decide what had happened, so I chalked it up to my imagination running away from me on a weird afternoon at a very unique tourist location. That night, after I ate a sandwich I had bought in some store somewhere and got ready to go to bed, I felt a presence somewhere out in the dark woods, observing me. I wasn't sure it was real, but it was that feeling you get when someone's watching you, and it made me feel nervous. I had no fire because I was camping in a wooded area that was not set off for camping. Nobody knew I was there, and I wanted to keep it that way to save money. Real campsites cost money, and I wanted to have some of that left by the time I got to where I was going. The idea that someone might be looking at me made me nervous for a number of reasons, as I didn't know if I might be trespassing, and I didn't know if this person might be a psycho killer. I decided to stay awake for a while longer, studying the tree line in all directions, looking for movement of any kind. "What are you running from, Daniel?" came the voice in my head. Or was it out in reality? I jumped to a standing position, staring in the direction I heard it come from. This time, it didn't sound like a man standing behind me. It sounded like someone in the woods out to my right. It also sounded like someone calling out, as though they were at a greater distance than last time in the park. "Who's there?" I called out, immediately feeling ridiculous, since it must have been an imagined voice. I was speaking to imaginary people. I must have been losing my mind. "Why are you hiding, Daniel?" came the same voice, but to the left, from off in the woods. That time, it really sounded like it was coming from out there, not from my inner thoughts. Who are you?" I asked in a voice that came out quavery and frightened, not tough and imposing, as I had intended. Why are you doing this to me?" "I'm not doing anything to you, Daniel," came the voice from yet a new location. "Don't you remember me? Here, let me show you." From a completely different direction than any of the voices, I heard a sound like twigs breaking and someone walking through the underbrush. And out of the woods emerged a tall, dark figure, too tall to be a man. My first thought was Bigfoot, and I tied it back to my experiences at the mystery park. They actually have Bigfoot footprint castings in the gift shop, and Bigfoot is associated with that entire area. My heart started beating really fast and hard, like a drummer in a speed metal band. Part of me wanted to run away, but it was night, and there was nowhere to run to. Plus, if that really was Bigfoot, it could outrun me. I wanted to hop in my tent and zip up, but that wasn't going to protect me from a cryptid who could throw his voice better than any ventriloquist in history. In spite of my fear, there has always been a part of me that has wanted to see Bigfoot in real life, so I grabbed my flashlight. Turning it on and shining it at the dark figure, I gasped as I saw something that made no sense at all to me. In fact, I was so surprised by what my eyes saw next that I jumped in the air and actually started to run away. I must have run 10 feet away from my tent before I remembered that this thing could be anywhere. Instantly, it had made its voice come from multiple locations and then appeared physically elsewhere. At that realization, all of the woods surrounding me became equally frightening. You can laugh at me if you want, but what would you have done if you expected to see either a man or a Sasquatch, but instead you saw a dog-headed man, like a werewolf? At the time, my mind twisted in circles like the trees inside the VORTEX park, trying to understand what my eyes were seeing. The closest thing I can compare it to is a werewolf from a movie. It didn't look like any kind of animal or human. It looked like it was part Bigfoot and part wolf. I don't mean that it looked like a dog and a Bigfoot interbred. I mean it looked like a Bigfoot with a wolf head. Like an entirely different kind of species than a Sasquatch. Since then, I've learned a lot about Dogman, but at that point in time, it was just not a thing in my world. I didn't think werewolves could possibly be real because I was under the impression that they had been created in the 1930s or 40s by Universal Pictures. The idea of seeing an actual werewolf there in the woods with me was not just scary in all the ways you might think, but it was as disconcerting and reality-bending as if the Frankenstein monster had been over there. Or Abbott and Costello, for that matter. I was seeing some kind of monster movie, but it was for real. I thought about my only few piddling means of defense I had on me, and I knew at once that none of those things would protect me from a beast that size. If it wanted to take me down, the fight would be over before it started. And besides, all my stuff was in my tent, which was 10 feet further away from me than it had been before I got scared and idiotically began running away. In short, I felt truly doomed and wished I could run to my mother. I felt like I was 10 years old again, and I fell into a pit of self-pity and infantile fear. It was not a very proud moment. "You're not Daniel," said the voice, now clearly coming from my right again. The Dogman was in front of me, but the voice had come from my right, and it sounded disappointed. Was this a bad thing that I was not Daniel? Or would it get angry that I was not Daniel? Had things just gotten a whole lot worse? I shone the flashlight on the dog-headed figure, and I watched as it turned around and re-entered the dark forest. Was that it? Or was something else about to happen? I ran into my tent and zipped up as though that were some kind of a defense against a supernatural voice-throwing cryptid. Inside, I shivered, even though it was a warm night. I remember making myself as small as I could, bunching my knees up in front of me, and trying to stay away from the walls of the tent. If something was going to grab at me from outside, I wanted to stay out of their reach. I had to force myself to stop hyperventilating before I passed out. Doing slow and deep breathing exercises I had learned online eventually helped to calm me down, but what calmed me more was that I didn't hear anyone else calling out to me, or, to my father. In the morning, I tried to chalk it up to a bad dream, but I know I was awake when this happened. It felt stupid to be frightened about werewolves when the sun was bright and shining, and the birds were singing, so I packed up and I moved on toward my eventual destination. The story kept nagging me from the back of my mind, though, and so once I got settled in a new home, in a new state, I decided to call my father out of the blue for the first time in over a decade. I wanted to ask him if he had ever been to Montana, and if he said no, I wanted to ask him if he'd ever had a really strange experience before. I rehearsed it in my head, over and over again, before calling. I wanted to be as open-ended in my questioning as possible, not to ask leading questions. I wanted to especially avoid asking him if he'd seen a dogman or werewolf, because I wasn't certain that was the crux of my sighting. That area is known for Bigfoot and UFOs. Maybe I encountered an alien presence and that was what was playing with my head. Maybe the Dogman had appeared as something else to my father. I didn't know. When I got through to him on the phone, he seemed to be in a very bad mood. Of course, he had usually been in a bad mood for my entire life, especially about me. When I told him it was important, and I asked him if he had ever been to Montana, he shouted at me that of course he had never been to Montana. After calling me a bunch of names, I found my confidence disintegrating, just like it always had when he shouted at me all through my childhood. It was hard to remember the questions I wanted to ask him, and I began to stutter. All of a sudden, it became embarrassing to try to ask about strange high weirdness, and I couldn't spit out what I wanted to know. He called me an idiot and a disappointment, and he hung up on me. So, I still don't know if that entity, whether it was a dogman or something else, was actually trying to talk to my father or not. Maybe I resemble somebody else with the same name as my father, I really don't know. I think the VORTEX is closed now, at least temporarily. Oddly, that gives me a feeling of relief. I have a nagging urge to go back to that place and bring at least one other person with me. I think it would be easier to gauge what was real and what was in my mind if I had another person who could double-check what I thought I was seeing or hearing or experiencing. But as long as the place is closed, I have an excuse not to go back there. Once it eventually reopens, I know that I will feel that urge to head there, back to the place I got the most scared in my entire life. I know the Dogman, or whatever it was, viewed me as a chicken and a disappointment the same way my father sees me. And somehow, I want to go back there, just to show the thing that it's wrong about me. I don't want to accept that I ran away with my tail between my legs because of the Dogman at the Montana VORTEX. The Dogman and the Doves of War. Dear Scary Stories NYC, when I was staying at an old friend's house in the country, I took a pre-dawn walk around the area he lives in. Everything looked so peaceful I wasn't even frightened at the sight of an upright, walking canine. I had my error corrected, however, in a most unforgettable way. I've lived in a major northeastern city for my entire life, but a few years ago, about half a year before COVID, one of my friends moved out into what seemed to me like the middle of nowhere. I can't remember if the place he drove me out to was called Muddy Creek Forks, or if that was the closest town or whatever, but safe to say I was not in the big city any longer. We drove past a big horse riding stable. We drove past cows, and we drove past chickens. He promised me that I would have the best sleep of my life that night, and after a few homebrews, I did pass completely out. Having gone to bed so much earlier than I was used to in the city, I also awoke before dawn. My friend was still sleeping, but I felt antsy, like I needed to do something. I went out for a walk even though the sun was not up yet. This was foolish of me, as obviously it was dark, and even more obviously I did not know anything about that location. I had been raised to think of the city as dangerous and the country as safe, but I learned that this is a silly way to look at the world. You need to respect wherever you are, as the entire world is potentially as dangerous as the most crime-ridden city hood. I set out, or so I thought, toward the stables. My inner child wanted to look at the horsies. Where I live, horses always seem to have policemen on their backs, you see. I don't know where I made my first wrong turn, but I'm sure I made more than a few lefts when I probably should have made rights. At any rate, I came upon a ranch-looking place with an old-fashioned handmade wooden fence surrounding it. In retrospect, I understand that it was an active and lived-in location, but my city boy eyes couldn't tell that in the dim light. I thought I was on abandoned land and that I was entirely alone. I lit a smoke and I chilled, wondering if I could find my way back to my friend's house on my own. I pulled out my phone, which didn't seem to be getting any signal at all. I tried to use the primitive GPS that I had on that old phone, but I kept getting failure messages. I was studying the path and the woods behind me, wondering which might be the fastest route back to breakfast, and which directions would lead to me getting even more lost than I already was. It was during this time when I first noticed the soft sound of cooing birds. Surprised that pigeons also lived in the country, I turned around to discover that it was actually about a half dozen doves. I never realized how similar doves looked to pigeons before, but I have to say, doves are far more beautiful. Some of them were white, some were a light brown color, but with their presence and their gentle noises, I felt an instant sense of peace and calm. It seemed as though everything was right with the world. The sky was beginning to turn reds and yellows and blues above the trees, and I experienced a very rare thing for a city dweller to feel. I felt truly present in that moment. Even though nothing important was happening, it all felt so epic. My entire life had led up to that moment, even though there was nothing momentous about it. In fact, I think it was the lack of content that made me so content. See what I did there? So, in that moment of deep breathing and utter happy relaxation, I doused my smoke and got ready to begin my attempt to return to where I had come from. At the last second before turning around, however, I saw a large figure emerge from the woods, walking toward the fence that the doves were alighting on. This very tall character came with an entourage of even more doves, flying around him, sitting on his shoulders, and cooing peacefully. It was almost like a scene from an early Disney movie, with the birds flitting around Snow White, and everything being all right with the world. As the figure moved more fully into my view, however, I could see it was the strangest looking man I'd ever seen. I don't mean to say anything rude about different body types or appearances at all. What I am trying to communicate is that this was so different as to not actually be any kind of human at all. First of all, he, and I'm certain this was a male, was covered in fur, or almost covered. There were patches missing, and perhaps it had mange or some affliction like that. It did have a broad chest like a human male, and it did stand erect on its hind legs, but the head was entirely inhuman. It had a snout not unlike a dog, but not exactly like a dog either. I've had people suggest to me that it was a kind of a wolf, but I've yet to find a wolf photo online that resembled what I saw. It was definitely in the canine family, however. The nose was a dark leather, whereas the creature's skin appeared something more like a gray version of human skin to me, at least in that lighting. The ears were not like human ears. They were like pointed dog ears or cat ears, and they were up on top of its head. I watched as this man-like upright canine interacted with the doves as though they were a family and had known each other for years. My sense of peace increased as I had the privilege of observing their private world for a few moments. Then the dog-headed thing turned and looked at me, and when it did so, its eyes exhibited a kind of eye shine that a city boy like me had never observed before. My heart began pumping, and adrenaline flowed through me as alarm bells went off in my head. I suddenly understood that I should not be where I was. The dogman's lips curled back, revealing teeth that looked like they could take down a horse with one bite. I found out later that you were never supposed to run from a predator. I hadn't heard that before, but it turns out that's what they say. I thought it made sense on that morning to run, so I ran like I never ran before. Almost immediately, my field of vision was entirely encompassed by fluttering wings in every direction I looked. The birds were beating their wings in the air on my face all around. They were attempting to claw at me, to nip at me, and it was all I could do to keep them away from my eyes and continue seeing where I was going. I quickly got lost in some trees, and panic began to set in. I saw a small metal shack by what might have been that same fence I had been watching the doves on earlier, and I ran toward it. I found it unlocked and I dove inside, slamming the aluminum door shut behind me. The glow of my cell phone showed me that I had locked myself in a tool shed of some sort. I looked around hoping to find something that I could use to defend myself. The sounds of cooing and fluttering wings outside now seemed terrifying to me, not peaceful at all. I hoped that the dog-headed beast man had not been following me as well, but the thud, thud, thud of bipedal feet stomping my way raised my internal fear even higher. Realizing that the lock on the door did not work, I grabbed some rope and began trying to tie the door shut as well as I could. My mother never let me be a Boy Scout because she said it would turn me Republican, so I lacked basic survival knowledge and skills. I was still tying a crappy and useless kind of a knot when I heard the immense man-dog breathing outside. He slammed either a fist or a shoulder into that aluminum door, almost caving the entire thing in with that one blow. There was a huge dent in the door pointing directly toward me. The edges of the door were no longer flush with the edges of the door frame, and I could make out fleeting images of that dogman moving back and forth out there. A second blow pushed the door even further out of whack, and I dropped the hoe I was considering using for my defense. I had no defense against this thing other than to pray. Actually, I don't even know how to pray, so basically I had nothing. I curled into a sort of fetal bundle in the corner of the shack, and my mind struggled to accept that the end was drawing near. I couldn't believe the situation I was in. I mean that quite literally. I also couldn't deal with the idea of the extreme pain I was most likely about to experience. I was definitely no longer at one with the now. There came a loud retort, a sort of explosion. I knew what a pistol sounded like as I had heard them fired down on the street below my apartment on a few occasions. This was something larger than that. I wasn't sure if I was hearing some kind of heavy-duty firecracker or if it was some kind of military-grade weapon, but I knew that the dogman and the doves had not made that sound. In fact, the cooing of the doves ceased and I heard them flit away. The dogman ran past the shack and off behind me into the woods, each of its footsteps shaking the ground a little less than the previous one as it made its escape. Something tore the shack door open easily, ripping my feebly tied rope away in the process. When the door was fully opened, I found myself viewing a middle-aged man who seemed extremely unhappy with what had happened to the door of his tool shed. He was also holding something in his hands that I wouldn't know the name of. After searching Google, I would say that it looked a lot like an AR-50. Those of you who know about that stuff would know better than me, but it was something like that. The muzzle seemed to be hot to me as I saw a wisp of smoke emanating from the end of it. Raising my hands over my head, I did what any city boy would do in that situation. I whimpered, I'm sorry, please don't hurt me," and pathetic stuff like that. "Oh, you're sorry, all right," came the gruff reply, "and you're gonna pay me for a new tool shed, too." I stuttered nervously that I would gladly pay and asked how much. When he named a price, I told him I would PayPal him twice that amount because he had saved my life. He gave me a look that I could not decipher, but I interpreted his expression to mean that he hadn't understood what I had said. I began to explain what PayPal was, and he cut me off abruptly. "I know what PayPal is, you moron," he growled out. "I prefer you pay me using Venmo." We walked back to his farmhouse to use his Wi-Fi, and I sent him the money. Once the payment went through, he let me call my friend to get him to come and collect me and bring me back. It turns out those two guys were good friends already, and I was forced to sit there and wait while they bonded for a while. I just wanted to get out of there. I was as scared of that man as I was embarrassed to have damaged his property. Actually, I didn't damage anything. It was the Dogman that busted up that little aluminum shack. That's just the city boy guilt I was raised to have, feeling like everything's always my fault. But I do admit I learned a lesson that day. Never assume you have the right to roam around on unfamiliar turf like you own it or something. Always be respectful of wherever you find yourself. And I was taught that unforgettable lesson by the Dogman and the doves of war. Don't go anywhere. We've got another Dogman story to go. But first, here's a rhyme dedicated to this episode's executive producer, James Tucker. Our EP is James Tucker, more badass than a guitar plucker. He's a man who don't play games, talking about our EP James. Please join me in thanking James Tucker for making this episode possible. In return, we share with him our weekly Sunday night secret uncensored Dogman stories, far too wild to ever run on this channel. If you'd like to become an executive producer like James Tucker, just join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com, or else do what James Tucker did and click the join link below this or any of our videos. And now, on to our second Dogman story of this 2 for Tuesday, and we call this magical tale, Be Careful What You Manifest. Dear Scary Stories NYC, how many stories have you heard that involve both magic and the Dogman? Well, I think I have one for you here. Actually, my mom insists that this is not magic at all, but that's sure what it seems like to me. I have to give you some background or you aren't gonna get any of this. So, in the last year of her life, my grandmother started teaching my mom about this weird guy that she was into called Neville Goddard. Neville lived during the 20th century, and my grandma used to attend his lectures in New York City when she was young. He allowed people to tape record his teachings, and you could find almost all of them now on YouTube for free. Bear with me now, because this gets weird. He claimed that everything he said stemmed from a coded reading of the book of John in the New Testament, where each character in the story is actually meant to stand for a different aspect of consciousness. His teachings were called New Thought in the 20th century, but Neville insisted these were ancient teachings, even when they were originally written down. I know half of you are confused and already fast-forwarding, but I've got to explain one more thing before we can get to the Dogman. According to the process that Neville taught, your subconscious mind loves your conscious mind and wants to provide it with whatever it asks for. When you go to sleep worried or angry, your subconscious interprets that as you asking for more worry and more anger. It then will begin to find just that for you. If you go to bed focused on poverty, you're more likely to wake up in deeper debt. Now, many modern Western psychiatrists would actually agree with Neville as far as that goes. They would say that you are creating a self-fulfilling prophecy, and that you are subconsciously more likely to do things the next day to increase your worry or your poverty or whatever you went to bed thinking about. The same can be said for those who go to bed feeling happy feelings. Go to bed imagining how great it would feel to have a new job, and you're a lot more likely to naturally and subconsciously maneuver yourself toward that satisfying new employment. Neville, however, always loved to take things too far. He argued that besides the factors I just explained, the subconscious also has powers to shape reality itself. That's the part I call magic, but my mom insists it is not. Neville felt that the subconscious works with the human imagination itself, and that nothing exists until it is first imagined. Call it magic, call it science, or call it hogwash. My mom believed in this stuff more and more after Grandma passed on, and I thought she was going bonkers. One day, Mom was waiting for one of her clients to PayPal her some money he owed her. She really needed that money for reasons I won't get into. I watched as Mom worried through the morning. Then at noon, she stretched out in her lazy boy recliner, and she fell asleep with a funny little smile on her face. When she woke up, she had received an email that the money was in her account. She told me about it excitedly. I told her that the money would have been there anyway. Now cut to a few weeks later when my mom was saying to me that another client of hers was lending her his cabin to use for a week. She asked me if I wanted to go with her as a vacation. I asked her where it was, and she said Western Pennsylvania. That's one of the places that Dogman lives. So of course I said yes. I got really excited, and not only because we'd been cooped up in that small house for so long, I also wanted to have my chance to see the Dogman in real life. That was when I decided to try my mom's crazy Neville Goddard magic nap trick to see if it really worked. I laid back in Mom's recliner, and I felt what it would feel like to be seeing the Dogman. It's important not just to think about it, but also to feel yourself in the situation, to be where you want to be as vividly as you can both imagine and feel it. Then, if you can hold on to that feeling and fall asleep in that state, it will manifest for you in your reality. I tried to put my skepticism aside and be as wacky as Neville and Mom, just to see if it would work. After all, seriously, what did I have to lose? So, we went out to the cabin, and bam, the first evening, there he was. Outside the cabin window, I saw a freaking werewolf, and I saw it staring at an owl. I had never seen an owl before either, and I was surprised how big those things are. What do I mean when I say I saw a werewolf? I mean, I guess I saw a Dogman, but an upright canine type of Dogman, not the giant wolf kind of Dogman. Imagine a German shepherd with longer, shaggier fur. It was not the broad-chested kind of humanoid Dogman or werewolf, though. This creature stood with its paws held in front, not to the sides like a human would hold them. It clearly had dog paws, if very large ones. There was nothing about them that looked like hands. There was no thumb. There were no long fingers. It was an oversized dog that stood on its hind legs. I hope you can visualize that in your mind, as it's not the kind of Dogman you usually show in your thumbnails. I called my mother over to the window and asked her what she saw out there. She said she saw an owl, some trees, some bushes. I pointed out where the Dogman was, and she gasped in horror. I never saw my mother so scared before. Her eyes were wide, her face was pale, and she looked like she was going to have an attack. I felt really bad because I thought she would be as excited as I was to see that Dogman actually exists. Instead, she felt a truly existential dread. She felt she was in the presence of evil, and she worried for our safety. Mom immediately started packing, saying we were going to be leaving at the first crack of sunlight in the morning. I felt so guilty I spilled the beans to her. I admitted I had used her Nevilism to call forth the Dogman. I told her it was something on my bucket list, but now I could scratch it off. Then I asked her to join me in Nevilizing that Dogman out of our lives. She thought about it for a long while, and then agreed. We both imagined how great it would feel if we were no longer in danger, and then we fell asleep. I woke up in the middle of the night and I looked out the window. There was neither a Dogman nor an owl out there, and I felt that we had been successful. Whether we had actually banished the beast or whether it just moved on randomly, we never again saw the Dogman for the rest of our week out in the wilds of Western Pennsylvania. Mom had a great time, and I had fun too. We both went back to the city refreshed and happier than when we had left. But it almost went the other way completely. And that's how I learned this very important lesson. Be careful what you manifest.
South Carolina. Protected from Dogman. As told to Peter Bernard, read by Madeline Starr. This is a story about the one time I had an encounter with a real dogman. It's also a story about my best dog friend of all time. His name was Skipper. He was a big old Malamute. I didn't name him, my brother Dirk did. But Skipper and I became much closer friends than he was with my brother. He was a husky, so that meant he wasn't far removed from being a wolf, and he needed a lot of exercise every single day or he would just freak out. I loved to play fetch and frisbee with him and take him to the park, and he repaid me by being my best friend. Skipper always looked out for me. When someone would raise their voice, Skipper would growl and make them stop yelling. He would always get between me and anyone who was unhappy. He made it clear that to get to me, you'd have to go through him, and nobody got to me. Not ever. One time, we took Skipper with us on a vacation to Lake Murray in South Carolina. My parents had rented us a cabin, really just one room with bunk beds, and so the four of us, Mama, Papa, Dirk the Jerk, and I, all had to share this tiny space and get on each other's nerves even more than usual. So Skipper and I went out for long walks and spent as much of the day to ourselves as possible. That evening, we were heading back, and it was starting to get dark. I heard a strange echo. Every time I would step down, I would hear an echo behind me and to my right. Then I noticed that Skipper started looking back in that direction as well. Just to see what would happen, I stopped short, and I distinctly heard someone or something stop short right after me, behind and to the right. Now Skipper was growling. I turned and looked, not knowing what I was expecting to see, but all that was there was a bunch of trees and foliage. I walked backward for a while, watching the woods. I didn't hear the echo any longer, but I hadn't heard whoever it was walk away either. I had a pretty good idea of their general location, and I felt as though I were being watched right then. I whispered to Skipper to run, and I dropped his leash. In the same instant, I turned and ran, away from the lurker in the woods. I was instantly surprised at the two things in the next split second. First, Skipper didn't run ahead of me in the road. He ran off into the woods instead. I was shocked and hurt that he would be disloyal to me. But I had other things to worry about because I could hear the lurker crashing out of the woods behind me. Risking a glance over my shoulder, I nearly tripped and fell when I saw what was chasing me. It was much larger than a man, and at the shoulders it was much wider as well. It had fur or hair all over and was darkly colored except for its bright red glowing eyes. It was a dog-like, demonic monster bear thing, and it was literally inches behind me. Maybe I thought Skipper knew something I didn't, or maybe my body was overruling my mind at that moment, but for some reason I tore into the woods. I heard Skipper barking off in the distance and ran in that general direction. There was a strange sort of little stone room there in the woods. I don't know how else to describe it. It had a small entrance I had to duck down to get into, and I had to stoop inside as well. I don't really know what the dirt floor structure was, but I know I hid in the furthest, darkest corner, hoping against hope that the wolf-headed bear man would not notice me in there. No such luck. It wasn't long before I could hear him sniffing in the ground outside the stone room. Now he howled, and it echoed inside my little prison, hurting my ears. Why was it howling? Was it calling its people to come for dinner? I shivered all over, not knowing how I could possibly get out of this insane situation. I never felt so helpless. The creature reached out a long, hairy arm into the opening, and I screamed. But then I could see that it wasn't able to reach me. It was too large to fit through the opening, and its arms weren't long enough to grab me. At least this bought me some time. The wolfman walked away from the door of the room, and I wondered if he had really left. I sat there in the dark listening. How long should I wait before poking my head outside, I wondered. Then, through the ground underneath me, I could feel something large approaching at a fast pace. Suddenly, something smashed heavily into the wall just to my right, and I screamed in surprise. But nothing moved. The wall hadn't been budged even a little bit. The big bad wolf man was trying to huff and puff and blow my house in, but he wasn't getting anywhere. I felt a renewed sense of hope, accepting that I was just going to have to wait this out. Sooner or later, someone would find me. Everything was going to be all right. I closed my eyes and decided to try to rest for a while. Then something hit me, hard. I opened my eyes as it hit me again. What is it? A branch. A long branch. Looking at the door to the room, I saw the dog-headed bear was poking me with a long branch. It had hands like a human, and it had the ability to create and use tools. This was not an ordinary animal. I backed to the other corner, where he had no direct line to poke me. I was technically closer to him, but still harder to reach. I don't remember how long he tried to get me out of there, but it felt like an hour. At some point I heard barking, and my heart sank as I expected that was the wolfman's tribe or family coming to help him get me out of this stone sanctuary. The bark was too familiar, though. It was Skipper coming back. That was just as terrifying, though, to me, as I didn't want my dog to be anywhere near the monster outside. I could hear the dogman run away, but I couldn't tell if he was running towards Skipper or away. Then I heard both of my parents calling my name, and I realized Skipper hadn't abandoned me at all. He had run to get my parents to rescue me. I ran outside like an idiot, not even looking to see if the dogman had actually left or not. I wanted to warn my family as much as I wanted to get out of there myself. When I saw my parents, I waved, but I didn't even slow down to say hello. I just kept running. I guess they got the idea and ran after me because we were soon back in camp, where I drank up half our water supply in a minute before trying to tell them what I'd seen. I wanted to go home right away, but my dad reminded me that if it hadn't been a werewolf, then it might have been a bear or a mountain lion, or who knows what that had menaced me. He suggested I stick to the lakeside area and not go into the forest alone anymore. That made a lot of sense. If you go walking on turf belonging to predators, you can't be surprised if you get yourself in trouble. I was acting like I was taking a walk in the park, but in reality, I was walking on the private hunting grounds of the South Carolina Dogman.
And now, get ready for an all-new, completely uncensored, slightly bloody, and absolutely terrifying new Dogman story. Oh, wait. YouTube won't allow me to tell you stories like that on this channel. If you want to hear that, you're going to have to go to peterbernard.com and sign up for our paid subscribers club. You can choose any price you can afford for a 1-month subscription, and then every weekend we tell you a story YouTube would never allow us to tell you on this channel. See you this Sunday for an all-new, very scary, completely uncensored Dogman story.
Locked in a car with Dogman outside. As told to Peter Bernard, read by Madeline Starr. This is a story about an experience I had in college that was the scariest thing that ever happened to me. At the time, I wasn't sure I would live to tell anyone what happened. This is about the one and only time I ever saw a dogman. But I didn't just see it. I got screamed at and menaced by it for almost 20 minutes. I hadn't known that Dogman had become famous until my granddaughter told me recently. I asked her what she was listening to on her Walkman, and she explained that first of all, it was her phone, and second of all, she was watching a video about Dogman. I thought that was a cartoon character, But she straightened me out quickly that Dogman is a kind of werewolf or wolf-headed ape man, and that it's not a cartoon but very, very real. I flashed back to 52 years ago when I saw a creature like that. I hadn't heard the term Dogman in those days, and I hadn't thought of it as a werewolf either. I guess I just called it a monster. It's not a thing you'd bring up in conversation unless you want everyone to think you're crazy. I just celebrated my 70th birthday, though, so I no longer care what anybody thinks of me, and I'm ready to tell this story I've mostly held inside myself all these years. Back then I was 18 and I was dating a boy in my college. Actually, now that I think about it, the date must have been 1968 when I was 20. I remember this because the boy I dated had his own apartment in Pleasant Valley, New York. I used to think of him when I heard the Monkees' song, Pleasant Valley Sunday. And I just learned from the internet that the song didn't come out until 1967. So I think I started dating that boy. Let's call him Nez, because he was a huge Michael Nesmith fan and wore a wool hat to look like Mike. When I was 19 and 20, and that would place this all in 1967 or 68. I eventually broke up with this boy because he was always promising me things to get me to go out with him, then substituting something far less cool. In fact, that's exactly how my Dogman story starts. Nez called me up and told me he wanted to take me to the movies, but not just any place. He wanted to take me to the coolest theater he knew. I, of course, said yes, and I went shopping to get a nice dress to wear on the date. He picked me up in his noisy car that always seemed to need a new muffler and proceeded to drive me to this patch of dirt on a hill overlooking a drive-in movie theater. I asked why we were parking in the middle of nowhere, and he told me the view from here was better than the view for the people who paid to go inside the drive-in theater. So he wasn't taking me to the movies at all. He was taking me to the forest, where we could watch a film with no sound. This is what I got dressed up for. Obviously, being a young man, he tried to snuggle with me, but I was not in the mood. I wonder why. After a while, he said he had to go do his private business, and he walked off into the woods, leaving me in the car alone. Now, looking around, I wasn't just bored and annoyed. I was starting to get kind of scared. It was really creepy out there at night. Upstate New York is very beautiful, and I tried to remind myself of that. But all I could think of is that campfire story about the man with the hook instead of a hand and the couple parked in Lover's Lane. Except at the end of that story, the boy drives away from the killer. My boy had left the driver's seat for parts unknown. I looked to see if he had left the keys in the ignition, but he had taken them with him. I couldn't get out of here, even if I wanted to. Nervously, I leaned over and locked the driver's seat door, and checked to see that both back doors were locked as well. Something caught my eye out of the rear window, and I did what they used to call a double take. There was a man standing outside behind the car. He was walking toward my window, emerging from the darkness into the moonlight. My eyes widened and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was a male, all right, but this was not a man. Not in the conventional sense, anyway. This was a hairy monster. I had read stories in the newspapers about monsters that haunted lovers' lanes, but I always thought, or hoped, that they weren't real. I figured they were the kinds of stories parents tell their kids to scare them into behaving. This thing caught sight of me in the car and nearly flew the last steps until it was right against my side window, breath fogging up my windshield, even though the night should have been too warm for that. This thing leaned down and pressed its forehead hard into the glass, making its ugly face even more terrifying in the process. It was a dog head, but some kind of devil of a dog, not a normal one. Its eyes shone in a way that a cat's eyes will shine when they stand in the dark and you photograph them with your flash turned on. Except this is what this dog-headed monster's eyes looked like to my naked eye. It slobbered like a dog, panting furiously in the way a dog does. Its front legs and back legs looked like thicker versions of a normal dog, except the front paws splayed out on my window to look more like hands or claws. The thumb was separated from the other fingers, but it wasn't a fully human-looking hand. I did suspect it could probably pick things up with those claws, though. It was like a dog, but like a monster at the same time, and it was angry at me. Unable to get through my side window, it jumped on the hood and it howled. Then it began beating on the front windshield with both claws balled up into fists, beating with the sides of its hands. I want to tell you I behaved bravely like the feminist icon I am. But in reality, I screamed a whole lot. I thought this was the end for me. I actually saw my life flash in front of my eyes like they talk about in books. I saw everything I had ever done, and I knew I wasn't ready to go. I wanted to get out of this, but the only thing I could do was sit there and pray the monster would go away. There was a sound of a big crash in the woods, and the dog-headed monster looked in that direction, then bounced off into the trees to investigate the noise. I figured it was Nez, and that he was a goner now. Instead, Nez came running up from the opposite direction, panicked-looking. I unlocked the door and he threw himself in, thrusting the key in the ignition all in one move. He was pulling the car out of the spot before he even got his door closed, and I thought we were finally safe. I was very wrong. The dog monster raced out of the forest toward the car, grabbing Nez's door and flinging it open before losing its grip on the door handle. We drove backwards onto the road behind us and spun out as Nez tried to make a right turn at too high a velocity. I could see the dogman running toward us, and he was catching up. Just as it made a leap to grab onto our bumper, the wheels found traction and we screeched and sped out of there. Nez closed his door doing 65 on the highway. And we finally discussed what had happened. He threw the rock I heard to distract the werewolf, then beat it into the car. I was glad he was okay, but in a way I sort of blamed him for everything that had happened. The resentments built and eventually led to our breakup. It wasn't that he didn't have money to spend. It was that he would bait and switch to trick me into doing things. I probably would have gone anyway if he had been honest, but I wouldn't have felt lied to. I eventually married a man of very modest means, but he was honest. I was very loyal to him and encouraged him. So by the time we were in our 30s, he had become very successful. Although he was only 62 when he left us, he had spent his entire life telling me the truth, and I will always miss him. But I'll tell you who I will never miss, and that is the Dogman.
I am the white-haired werewolf. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I woke up with white dog fur all over my bed the other morning, and as I slowly brought myself back to full consciousness, I struggled to understand where it had come from. I don't own a dog, let alone a white one. Yet when I stood up, I saw it all over the mattress and even my pillow. I took a shower, and I washed more of it off of myself. It was the same whitish, grayish shade that the hair on my arms and legs has become as I've aged. And that's when it dawned on me. I am the white-haired werewolf. This came as a greater shock to me than it was when my sideburns first went gray, or when all of my hair went gray. Women still found me attractive enough when that happened, and I was able to get attention from the more mature ladies, the ones who used to call me little boy and junior when I hit on them in my youth. It felt like an upgrade or an improvement when my hair whitened, but seeing that my werewolf self has aged along with my human form, that was jarring and unsettling to me. I guess I'm an old man. I'm likely not going to live that much longer. Somehow, with the strength, speed, agility, and healing powers granted to me by the curse of lycanthropy, I had come to live under the delusion that I was infallible. Oh, sure, I was a sinner. Obviously, I'd become a killer, but I almost never grew tired, so I would surely not grow old. I had begun to think of myself as immortal. If I wasn't a god, I was at most one step under it. I was like Hercules, only an immoral, violent, furry Hercules. I was going to live forever, and I was always going to win. This realization that none of that was true hurt like the punch to the stomach that supposedly did Houdini in. I'm not a vampire who lives his undead life forever unless he runs into a Van Helsing. Instead, I am a werewolf, and werewolves only live as long as a human being does, even in the best case scenario. Living my life of adventure for so long, getting away with anything I tried for so many decades, I guess I had come to be in denial about my own mortality. I've never really told my life story before, but now, as I see it flashing before my eyes, I feel compelled to tell somebody how I came to be a werewolf and how I survived to become the old man who stares back at me from the mirror. When I got back from Nam in '71, I hit the ground running, in spite of the foot injury that sent me home in the first place. My father had a job waiting for me in his real estate firm, and I had my pick of all the cutest young women of that place and time. It was presumed by all that I had a bright future ahead of me, and back then, women used to want to marry guys with a bright future ahead of them. I can't tell you what women want anymore, but back then, they wanted me, and I was quite happy playing the field. In my job, I would associate with people from all levels of society. I had working class friends, I was pals with butlers and maids, but I was also on a first-name basis with their masters. I would go bowling sometimes with maintenance men, and then I might go golfing with their landlord on Sunday. And so I found myself one fine weekend hunting for a pheasant with someone who, at the time, was one of the most famous names in politics. I won't tell you who, but you're probably too young to remember him anyhow. Hunting, to people as rich as this guy, meant he would have his servants tie some pheasants to a tree. Then he would either walk or drive a golf cart to the tree in question. At that point, he would, quote, hunt, unquote, the poor birds who were unable to fly away. How sporting, huh? What a fine pastime. So on the particular day when this particular gentleman and I made our way to that particular tree, fate was ready to deal me a joker card. I fired all my shots, deliberately missing the poor birds tied up there. So I was completely unloaded and defenseless when a hairy beast, 1.5 times my size, apparently alarmed and offended by the racket I had just made, burst out of the underbrush. It was so large that at first I thought it was a bear, but the sounds it made were far more canine. If this was a dog, it was the largest and most over-muscled one I had ever encountered. I was an athletic guy, and I was a little over 6 feet tall. I don't think I ever had any reason to be frightened of anything since I left the service, but I squealed in fear like a baby boy when that mega dog flew out of the tree line only a few feet in front of me. Before I could move an inch, the wolf dog dove in my direction and threw me backward, landing on top of me. It felt as though I were being devoured when the lights went out. And then I woke up in the hospital. The harsh fluorescent lighting hurt my eyes, but my throat hurt even worse. I reached for my neck, which was patched up, and my father stood ordering me to stop. He explained that I had been attacked by a mad dog, and that the doctors had to test me for rabies and other things. I needed to stay still so that I didn't rip the intravenous out of myself. According to my father, the gentleman who was with me fired round after round into the dog as he was assaulting me, which only made the creature angry. The immense canine got up and growled at my hunting partner, then calmly and defiantly walked off into the woods on his own time, not at all in a rush. Since the beast had not been brought down and tested for disease, I would need to be the one who was tested. Although the doctors and nurses poking and prodding at me was uncomfortable and went on for some time, we all got a big surprise when my bandages were taken off to be replaced with clean ones. My wounds were already completely healed in under 24 hours. One of the doctors called it a miracle, which earned him a scowl from the other specialist. There are no miracles in medicine, he was admonished. I suppose the ego of some doctors is so huge, they even want to take credit for divine intervention. It must have been the masterful way that doctor told the nurse to bandage my wound that healed it. All praise be to the AMA. When I finally went home with my father to stay with him for a while, I felt fine. In fact, I felt better than ever. Still, Dad would give me these worried looks and glances as though he were concerned about my health. I wanted to go back to the bungalow I was renting and resume dating every woman alive, but he refused to let me out of his sight. One night soon after, Dad had some old gentleman with an Eastern European accent come over, and he sent Mom to stay with her best friend for the evening. This way, we three men could have a private conversation. It turned out that this gentleman was a doctor from Europe, a specialist of some kind. They gave me the scientific term for his field of expertise, but it meant nothing to me and I can't remember the word now. The doctor proceeded to take some samples of my blood, hair, skin shavings, and fingernail clippings. He said he was going to test these things to be certain, but he felt fairly sure already what the results were going to confirm. Well, what are they going to confirm, Doc? I asked, my mind on other things already, just humoring these two old men because I had to. I'm afraid you're going to have to accept that you've become a werewolf, the guy told me in a grave manner. Well, I laughed. I laughed hard. I told my dad, okay, you got me. You got me good. I thought this was something for real, but it was just an elaborate practical joke. Dad and I used to pull practical jokes on each other ever since I was a kid, but this one was on a new level. I was so relieved that this was only him trolling me, and I leaned down to give my dad a big, loving hug. He sat there, stiff, immobile, not hugging me back. When his mouth was by my ear, he softly spoke. "It's not a joke, son," I heard. "Sit down and listen to the man." And so I sat back down, my jaw hanging open in total stunned amazement, as the two men told me that from now on, I would be turning into a werewolf from 1 to 3 times each month, and that I would become a killing machine when I did so. The good parts of it were that I would have an extraordinary ability to heal from wounds, and that I would essentially have superpowers when I was transformed, but everything else about it was seriously bad news. I listened, and I took mental notes, but I couldn't bring myself to actually believe these two guys. When the next full moon approached, my father reminded me and warned me. I began to wonder if he was losing his mind in his old age. He asked me to humor him once more and spend the night in his house that night, and the next 2 nights as well. When I showed up, though, I found that he wasn't going to let me stay in my old bedroom, nor was I to sleep in the guest bedroom. Instead, he led me downstairs to his basement. I was really insulted by the idea of having to sleep in the basement, and I'm afraid my temper grew short. I wanted to quit my job working for Dad's company on the spot and go find some work at somebody else's real estate agency. I wasn't prepared emotionally or in any other way for the idea of starting my own company back then, but had enough of a resume and track record to be able to get a decent gig elsewhere. I blew up at my father, half hoping he would just fire me so that I didn't have to get up the nerve to quit. Dad remained calm. When I would raise my voice, he would just say, "That's the werewolf talking, not my son." He seemed so sad, and yet he had his emotions under control, and a sense of doing his duty about his speech and mannerisms. Eventually, I relented and allowed him to lock me into a reinforced chamber that he had built in his basement. He told me that the walls of the room were over 2 feet of concrete thick, and that the heavy wooden door had 7 different locks in it. I would be secure through the night, and we could find out once and for all if I was still normal, or if I was cursed to become the same kind of being that had attacked me on that day. I went to sleep on an inflatable mattress on the concrete floor, grumbling to myself that my father was insane. I woke up in the woods, sleeping on a filthy, torn-up blanket that looked like it had been left there for some years before I was born. It probably was. I was covered in leaves and wearing nothing but my pajama bottoms, which were muddy and frayed at the lower ends. Having absolutely no idea where I was, I chose a direction and started walking. It took some time to find a road, and much more time to find someone to stop for the topless dirty man wearing only pajama pants. A truck driver stopped for me, acting friendly. I gave him my address, but he chose to drive me to the police station instead. My father came and picked me up, and the cops had a good laugh at our family's expense. I no longer had any doubt that my father's assessment was correct, but I had no memory of what had happened the night before. My father took me to his basement and showed me for myself. The wooden door was bashed open from inside, and the inflatable mattress, well, it would never inflate again. I looked at the remains of that security door, and I understood that the creature I had become and would continue to become each month was far more powerful than the strongest human beings in history. I had become, and would continue to become, a sort of a savage Superman. My father was concerned with rebuilding the room in his basement. He had a few ideas about putting in a door closer to that on a bank vault to try to keep me inside. I let him talk, but I had a better idea. If the wolf wanted to be in nature, let the wolf be in nature. I felt more on the werewolf's side already than on the side of society and humanity, but I knew that the best way to save people's lives would be to allow the wolf to take out his bloodlust elsewhere on other species. I drove out onto an estate with a few acres of woodland surrounding it that our company had not been able to sell yet. I parked my car around back, where I knew I could find it in the morning. I brought a hearty, cold-cut dinner to see if that might reduce the werewolf's appetite, and I wandered out into the woods. I marked trees along the way with red ribbons to show me the way back in the morning, and then when I awoke, under one of the red ribbon trees, I easily made my way back to the car, having no memories at all of what had happened when I had become the wolf. I most assuredly had transformed the night before, as once again I was without a top, and the bottoms of my pajama pants were all dirty and frayed. Once back at the car, which I had left open with the keys in it, I changed into the clothes I had left for myself and drove back to my bungalow to take a good long nap. Even in the beginning, I would be very tired the day after having become the wolf. These days, I get so tired that I literally only leave the bed to eat and use the men's room. Being superhuman takes an awful lot out of you. I remember more now than I did in the early days about what the wolf sees and hears and smells and does. It's still only a partial memory, though. I'm not 100% sure why, but how many memories do you have that date back to before you knew how to speak? Granted, that's a long time ago, but most of us have already forgotten our baby memories when we were still very young kids. I really think that learning language changes how we think and how we understand our surroundings. And I think it also changes how our memories function at a base core level. Before words, the world is one whole complete combination thing. Once words arrive, we see every single aspect as separate from every other aspect. I know from the flashes of memory I have from time to time that the wolf does not see the same world that you and I do. To him, everything is everything, and he is on a search for the good tasting parts of that one unified everything. Like how a goat will dine on grass and anything else green, plus lots of stuff that's not green. The wolf and the werewolf will dine on anything that moves in the way an animal does. But it's the animal part of the one giant unified something that the wolf is interested in. It's at once both a simpler and a more sophisticated vision of the space we inhabit. I don't really know if I can express it in words, as words are the reason humans stop seeing the world in this way. My father could never understand my strongly held feelings about myself and the werewolf, and so soon I discovered that I had to keep changing my location on each full moon. I had to make certain that he didn't know where I was going to be. His well-intentioned meddling was never going to help anything, and it could have ended up with him getting severely injured. Or worse. It was my condition, not his, and I resented his constant intrusions and lectures. As soon as I could manage, I got a job in another state, and I began to live as separately from him as I could figure out how to do. I've never become rich, but I've become rich enough. I have multiple options for coping with my lycanthropy each month, and I have built my life around this. To my knowledge, I haven't ended the lives of any human beings, although obviously I can never know for absolutely sure. Most months lately, I only turn one night, and then the other two I mainly get a bad headache. I did turn 2 nights 1 month about, 6 or 7 months ago now, so I still prepare for the 3 nights of the full moon each time. I'm ready the day before and the day after, as well as the official full moon day. I never know what time the transformation will take place, as it is a myth that the werewolf only comes out at night. It has more to do with the placement of the moon in proximity to me than anything else. Generally, yes, it happens at night, but it pays to be careful about it in that regard. I've never married as a result of this situation, and I've remained a bachelor long after my friends all got married and became conformists. My thinking never became dulled down like theirs. I never registered for a political party. I never got a favorite sports team. I am my own favorite sports team, really, and the game I play is the game of life itself. I don't know why people choose to become more boring as they grow old. If they think they're choosing safety or security, they're kidding themselves. There is no such thing as safety, and there is no value in security. Life is a constant danger and a permanent security risk. If you don't get taken down by illness, or a hit-and-run driver, or an attack of your heart, or an attack from an assailant, then you'll get taken down by someone like me. And me? I am the white-haired werewolf. I got a Dogman for Christmas. Dear Scary Stories NYC, although it seems a lifetime ago, I grew up with a silver, nay, a platinum spoon in my mouth. These days, I'm just a middle-aged, middle-level manager as my family lost all its money. But it wasn't always so. And one time, my parents, who were masters at squandering wealth, bought me the most ridiculously expensive and dangerous present of all time. When I told them that I wanted a werewolf for Christmas, they took me somewhat literally, and on that sunny holiday morning, I was presented with an actual, real, living and breathing Dogman as my present for the year. I don't expect you to believe me, but I'll give you all the details anyway. I told my coworkers at my current job, and now they all think I'm crazy. They don't mess with me any longer, though, so it's not all bad being the crazy one. This story happened back when I was too rich to be called crazy. The worst anyone might have tried to accuse me of back then would have been that maybe I was a tad eccentric, but even then it would have been a term used as politely as possible. When you are rich, you don't live in the real world, and you don't know it either. You think people are all nice, and you think they were born to serve you. Now, I'm one of the people who the rich think of that way, so I guess I'm lucky. Unlike my former peers, I now know the difference between fantasy and reality. Then why am I telling you a story about a werewolf? Because even if Mr. Peter Bernard and Scary Stories NYC refuse to tell you that this is a true story, I'm telling you that's what it is. It happened to me, and it's all real. But I don't have any proof. I don't have any photos, and so I don't expect you to believe me. Nevertheless, here's what happened. On Christmas morning that year, I awoke excited, as I always had, even though I guess I was beginning to outgrow Christmas. I had even skipped watching Rudolph when it came on TV that year. I went downstairs and was really kind of shocked to find 0 presents with my name on them under the tree. I saw some from my mom to my dad and some from him to her, but for the most part, the area under the tree was stunningly bare. I tried not to hyperventilate, and I went into the kitchen where Hilda was serving my parents' breakfast. I can't remember exactly how it went down, but I tried to hint that it was Christmas morning, and usually, on Christmas morning, there were presents for me under the tree. But this Christmas morning, there were none. Both parents and Hilda acted uninterested in what I was saying, except Hilda acted surprised when I said it was Christmas morning. "Dios mío," she exclaimed. "I totally forgot." I felt crestfallen. Forgetting Christmas, that was even worse than forgetting my birthday. I was a spoiled child, and this was the first time in my life something hadn't gone my way, so it hurt inside. I kept a stiff upper lip, though, because I was raised to hide my weaknesses from the world. I tried to eat some breakfast, but I was feeling too sorry for myself to swallow anything but my pride. I began to wonder what I would do with my day, since it was not really Christmas any longer. Then, the doorbell rang, and my father told me I should come with him. I hated when he would make me go and watch him do adult stuff. It was always so boring, and I was pre-bored on this day. Nevertheless, stiff upper lip and all that, so I soldiered out to the front of the house with my father, and I was greeted by a long trailer and a small crew of men. Dad led us all around to a complex on the side of the house that I had seen being built for over a month, but I lacked the slightest bit of curiosity about that winter. That was adult stuff. My parents were always adding new wings and rearranging the furniture, and I really didn't care. The long truck was backed up to this gate, and I was very surprised to see the men lock the two into place. It was apparent that the gate had been built specifically to receive a shipment from that truck, or at least from a truck with that odd and specific set of attachments on its back end. I wondered what could be happening, and I was starting to become interested. Suddenly, and loudly, a brown blur emerged from the back of the truck and clanged along the metal attachment into the enclosure beyond it. What was that? I asked out loud because I literally saw something move so fast that I couldn't tell what it was. Besides, large. My father laughed and told me that was my Christmas present. Huh? Dad seemed to think this was the funniest thing that ever happened. He kept laughing as he led me into this building which contained an elevator and little else. We got in and rode up to a room with large glass windows that seemed to magnify the view outside. I remember it also had television monitors showing cameras in different parts of the land our house was situated on. I was really surprised that Dad had closed off this much of our land. I remembered playing cowboys in one place I was looking at. I remembered taking walks in another. I was kind of unhappy that all that land was now going to be inaccessible that next spring and summer. I was about to say something along those lines to my father when I first caught a glimpse of it. The big brown thing that had whizzed by me was drinking from the stream that ran through our backyard, or former backyard. I was able to see that it was some kind of very large dog-like thing, bent down on all fours, licking the water. It was not actually a dog. Clearly it was something wild. This was not a pet. It was an exotic wild thing of some sort or another. I got as close to the glass as I could. I remember holding my breath in complete confusion and wonder, waiting for the animal to finish drinking and lift its head. Then I might be able to understand better what I was seeing. In one fluid movement, as sudden as it was unexpected, the brown, hairy thing down there reared back its head, an entire body, rising up off the ground as he did so. I was so surprised that I breathed out inadvertently on the glass an inch from my face, fogging it up. I couldn't see what the creature was through the fogged glass, and I backed away, moving to another position to see what exactly it was that had risen up out there. You know what I saw. You know what it was. It was the beast who walks like a man. It was the dog-headed wild man. It was either a full-time werewolf or it was a dogman. My father had taken me literally and gotten me a werewolf as a pet, complete with his own habitat. It was tall. It was brown. It stood like a man. I never got an actual measurement of its height. I don't think anyone ever got close enough to pull out the measuring tape. It was taller than a tall man, and wide enough that it left what looked like very large and very deep dog tracks in the snow or the dirt. It had a set of huge choppers that seemed to have been designed for a different and larger head. Its eyes were black in the day, but glowed a sickly yellowish off-white when it was dark. The creature would sometimes squat there and howl mournfully, sounding sadder than any living creature should be allowed to sound. His song was so sorrowful that it would sometimes reduce me to tears, in much the same way that a great singer performing a beautiful aria can. It took me a while to learn all of this, but the enclosure was not just a fenced-in area, but also a place that had a kind of electrified top on it as well. Apparently, the fences were all electrified at the top level all the way around. The dogman would be able to climb up a certain amount of the way, assuming it had climbing skills, but it would not be able to climb high enough to jump over the fence. My father explained to me that it was unbreakable and a perfect system to prevent the dogman from ever escaping. My father always thought his plans were perfect and impenetrable. It took a bit of experimentation to figure out how to feed the creature, as he came with no instructions. On the first day, a large amount of red meat was dropped into the pen. The dogman walked over to it bipedally, smelled it from all angles, then proceeded to urinate on the meat. Then he went and climbed a tree. The animal expert Dad had hired to supervise the dogman's care said he was marking the meat as his turf to prevent other animals from eating it. The expert also claimed that the dogman would probably stop doing that once he realized that there were no other animals with him in the pen. But the expert was wrong, and the dogman never came back to eat that meat. It rotted and smelled something awful. It stunk up the viewing area, so Dad ordered one of the men to get that ruined meat out of there. A hook and pulley system was set up, and there were repeated attempts to hook the meat at the end of the line and pull it up out of there. They removed some of the offending flesh, but when they dropped the line back down to grab more of it, the dogman ran up and grabbed the end of the line, nearly pulling the worker down into the pit with him. I was there watching, as two men grabbed that guy's legs and pulled him back to safety. From then on, nobody ever fed the dogman any meat at all. And yet, he didn't starve while in our captivity. I had observed him in the trees hunting birds in a most peculiar manner. He reminded me more of a spider catching a fly than any sort of canine I had seen before. The dogman would climb a tree as far as he could without making the trunk bend, and he would sit small against that trunk, camouflaging himself with leaves if possible. Once he was in his hunting blind, it was almost impossible to notice him there any longer. You had to either see him get into position, or you had to use the heat sensors on the cameras around the habitat. Since the caged-in forest area was open to the sky, birds would occasionally alight on the tree branches. When they would, the silent but deadly dogman would catapult out of the darkness and grab the bird as it attempted to fly away. Consuming it within seconds, the dogman would either then scramble back into position or drop down the tree at an alarmingly quick pace and then scoot up into the branches of a different tree. I don't know why it would sometimes choose to do one instead of the other, and maybe it didn't know either. Maybe it was just following its gut instinct. I honestly can't tell you. The expert said he had chosen a particular tree because the fruit of that tree is attractive to birds. But the very next hour, the dogman climbed a different tree that was not fruiting. Have you ever seen one squirrel scramble after another climbing up and down the trunk of a tree? I don't know if that means it's mating season or if one of the squirrels stole the other one's nuts, but I once saw a giant-sized version of the same kind of chase, with the dogman chasing a squirrel he clearly had picked out for lunch. One day the dogman tried to eat a crow for lunch, but he was swarmed by a ton of other crows, arriving at the area almost as though they had been alerted to come psychically. Maybe they were heading there anyway, but it sure seemed odd the way it went from one bird to 30 or 40 in such a short time. The dogman dropped to the ground in a second, racing on all fours across to the other side of the enclosure to escape being pecked to death. The crows screamed and squawked in angry defiance at the dogman. It sure sounded like a complex language to me on that day. I could only imagine the kinds of foul language their squawking would translate into if we knew how to do such a thing. So add that to the information pool. A large enough group of crows can cause a dogman to retreat, at least while in captivity. One day we found the remains of a young deer on the property, but we could not find any footage of the dogman having captured the animal, nor of him consuming it. One theory was that it had already been there when they released the dogman, and that he had nothing to do with its demise. That was an unsolved mystery of that period. I wasn't allowed to tell any of my friends about the dogman, which limited how much fun it was to have one. When other kids bragged about their Christmas presents, I had to lie about mine. It sucked, because I'm certain I had the best present of them all, but I just couldn't tell anybody. At some point, I talked my dad into throwing some living rats down there to give the Dogman some more food and some sport as well. Turned out to be a bad idea, as the rats simply tunneled their way out of the pen underneath the fences, and we then had to get exterminators to rid our house and property of these same rats. An even worse result was that the Dogman was inspired by the rat tunnels. Demonstrating enough intelligence to be able to learn new behaviors, the Dogman enlarged one of the rat tunnels and easily escaped under the fence one night in an area of the enclosure that was hidden from camera view behind some overgrown foliage. I don't want to get into the news reports in the first few weeks after that. A rash of house pets disappeared, and some human beings as well. I'm not saying that our escaped Dogman was responsible for some or all of those disappearances, but at the time, I strongly suspected it. We had stupidly allowed a deadly and possibly man-eating predator loose in our upscale community. Although my father seemed unperturbed by it, I was guilt-ridden and horrified. I had nightmares that I was the monster, that I was the Dogman on the loose in the posh gardens of my birthplace, dining on succulent peacocks plucked off the lawn of a local CEO. I also had dreams where it was the end of the world, and everyone was hiding from the Dogman. Every closet door I opened had someone hiding there already. I wanted to hide in a basement, but someone was there. I dug a hole in the dirt to hide in, and came upon someone already under the earth, shouting at me to go find my own hiding spot. Each time I hear of or read an account of someone seeing a Dogman, I wonder if it was the one that escaped from us that they are reporting, or possibly a descendant instead. How many reports of upright walking canines can be traced back to the one we failed to keep locked in? How much human suffering is directly attributable to our act of negligence? Speaking of negligence, I was under the impression that all of the footage shot by the cameras in the Dogman enclosure was being recorded for posterity, since this was such a rare find. I didn't find out until after the escape, though, that each day's camera footage was recorded over with the next day's footage. My father wanted no evidence that he had ever had a Dogman living on his property, since he seemed certain that it was what he called beyond illegal to have done that. When I was a kid, I thought that the term beyond illegal was just a silly expression my dad made up because he was a nervous Nelly. Later on, I found out that he meant it was not technically illegal to have a Dogman on your property, but you can get in trouble far worse than legal trouble if certain people and organizations found out that you were in possession of such a creature. Don't ask me to explain it better than that, because that was where I made my dad stop his explanation. I just don't want to know information that can get me, quote, more than arrested, unquote. As I live my humdrum day-to-day survival-oriented existence, I find it hard to believe that my life ever involved captive werewolves and all the other absurd excesses that my family reveled in. I'm grateful that my parents had such expensive habits and blew their fortune. If they had left me any money at all, I might have ended up like them. It's hard to believe that there really was a year in which I could exclaim in all honesty that I got a Dogman for Christmas.
Thanks for watching till the end. If you liked what you saw, please consider clicking like on the video or sharing it. You can become a channel member by clicking the join link below. Then you can check our community page to find the links to 10 hours or more of secret, uncensored Dogman stories too wild to be told on this channel. Your other option is to join our paid subscribers club at peterbernard.com. That's Peter's homemade club, where he will personally email you the links as well as occasional secret club club messages. You may also be included as an executive producer in a future episode. You have a scary experience you want to tell us about? You can email us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com, or else call our Scary Stories voicemail hotline at 804-LESS-SCARY. The machine cuts off every few minutes, so if you have a long story, please keep calling back and we'll piece it together later on. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.